Hi, my name is Phil Anderson, and I'm running for United States Senate to represent Wisconsin. This might be a little bit of a long explanation today, what I want to talk about, but I think it's very, very important because I'm going to somewhat dissent from the general opinion and position of most libertarians on a particular issue, and that is this idea that money is speech. As you know, as libertarians, we are 100% in favor of the Constitution. Well, at least the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights. We do have questions about prohibition, if it still were in effect, the income tax, and the direct election of senators. But generally speaking, we're in favor of the Constitution, and our adherence to the Constitution goes back farther than the Constitution itself, actually, because we adhere to the ideas and writings of John Locke, for example, who talked about a good many things that resulted in ideas and precepts that became part of our Constitution. The idea that men and women, of course, have inalienable rights, that they have things inherent to themselves that government can't and shouldn't take away, should not take away, but also should be charged with defending. And I think, of course, that adheres with the Constitution. This idea that money is speech, though, to me it's pretty questionable, actually. Well, the First Amendment, of course, guarantees the freedom of speech, and the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, followed up with that, saying that money is speech, and therefore the use of money in political campaigns shouldn't be restrained in certain ways because money is speech. To me, doesn't make a ton of sense, because in the day of our founders and in the day of John Locke, they didn't live in an environment in a society that we do today, where basically speech can be bought up, so to speak. It can be dominated. Back then, the idea that freedom of speech was important was so that people could speak in the public square, could communicate with one another, that the government wouldn't suppress speech with violence and things like that. Freedom of the press goes along with that as well, because the press has to be free to express the speech of not only the people that own the press, but those citizens that they choose to help by expressing their speech. Wonderful system. But now we have a society where, in effect, the amount of speech that can reach people's ears, which is, I think, the goal of the First Amendment anyway, not that people are speaking out into the atmosphere or into a deaf audience, but that it can be heard and considered, I think is the other part of the First Amendment that's very important. And the system that we have now allows big money interests to basically monopolize speech. I mean, I can still have the same conversations with my friends and neighbors, but when it comes to spreading political ideas, especially ideas that might challenge the status quo and the two-party system, we find it difficult to express those because the speech is bought up. We're big fans of the free market, but when there's a lot of money behind expressing only one or two political views, then the market changes for those of us who don't have the money to get in the market. So it's not really an even opportunity for people to express their speech. And I think this is covered by something of John Locke's called Locke's Proviso. Now, Locke's Proviso says that people can go out and settle on land and take advantage of resources as much as they want. They basically own it, claim ownership of it, by settling on it and improving it in some way. So you settle on a piece of land, you plant some crops, you till the soil, etc., etc., you build a fence, you build a house, whatever. It becomes yours because of the fact that you've claimed it and because you've made improvements upon it. You've added value to it. You've added your labor to something that already existed, and therefore you've made it yours. But Locke goes on to write that only works as long as there is as much or as good for other people to still use. So if there were just 1 acre of tillable land left in the United States, let's say, it would not be, according to Locke's idea of justice and the understanding of human rights, that one person could just claim it and do what they want with it, because there would not be the same opportunity for everyone else. I think Locke's Proviso also applies to the freedom of speech, because in our day and age, if there's only a certain amount of networks, a certain amount of newspapers, a certain amount of opportunity for people's ideas to get to other people's ears, to get their attention, to be mentioned in debates, for example, editorial pages, whatever it might be, then there's not as good or as much for people who are new to the game to be able to get their ideas out. Now, Locke didn't specifically say that was an idea directed at speech. It was more directed at land, because at the time there was discernibly finite amount of land, especially good land. So it made sense for him to talk about that proviso. And in our current times, there is a somewhat finite amount of speech. A person, any of us who get to make political decisions and make votes and voice our opinions, have a limited amount of time and opportunity to gather the thoughts of other people, to consider them. And if that's dominated by huge money interests, and much of the public is only has an opportunity to hear from a few sources, especially in a debate forum, then to me that violates the spirit of Locke's proviso in a way that should apply today to free speech and Citizens United. Now, I understand that there are very powerful arguments that money is speech, and I don't really have an answer, and this is maybe one time, hopefully the only time, where I'll say, as your senator, I don't have this fully worked out yet, what I would do as your senator, serving in the Senate to further this view, to express this in a way, to back certain legislation or whatever. But I will say this. I think it's important that we understand that that money in politics is a dangerous mix, obviously. It influences elections. You've seen it in the Democrat and Republican nominating processes. We see it in the mainstream media every day. Now, the internet allows for dissent and for access to different views, but you really have to know what you're looking for to go find it. You have to have conversations with people, and they say, hey, have you heard of this guy, Ludwig von Mises, or Ron Paul, or Tom Woods, or whoever. You need to go out and find them. If you're more passive about it, then all you get is what you get from the mainstream media. And I think that looking back at what the founders expected, what they understood as an opportunity to not only speak freely, but to hear freely, Locke's proviso applies to free speech now. And we should try to at least consider that the idea that money is speech and money in politics and influencing people in that way is good and legal and moral. I dissent from that. That's not settled, I don't think. And I'm not willing to say and just toe the party line and say that it's settled. I'm not willing to vote that way in the United States Senate either. If it were to come up for vote where there were campaign reform, finance reform to consider, I would not necessarily vote in favor of any sort of campaign finance reform, because a lot of that does influence speech in a way that's very negative. But I would definitely consider the idea that there's not always enough or as good opportunity for people to express their opinions and be heard in public, and would take that into consideration. Sorry for the long one tonight. Had a long day doing yard work, getting ready for my daughter's graduation party, which is in a couple of weeks. Maybe that's a little loquacious, I don't know. So I apologize for being at 7 minutes and 45 seconds right now. But I hope that all makes sense to you, and you understand that I'm wrestling with this issue that's extremely important, and to me, not completely settled. Thanks very much, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow.